So it is a great pleasure and an honor to be chairing this session. I'm Argyris Stringaris. I'm Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at UCL, and together with Essie Vidding, the Pro-Vice-Provost for Grand Challenges in Mental Health and Wellbeing. Today's session is about behavior change, which is an extremely important topic for public, but also individual health. A lot of work has been done in this field, less so as with any field, I guess, in child mental health. So today we're going to listen to real experts in this field talking about it. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming Professor Leslie Gutman and Professor Angel Chater to today's session. We'll start with Professor Gutman. The talk is about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have questions. Unless you have a very, very, very burning desire to ask something technical during the talk, I would suggest that we reserve the questions for right after the talk, where we're going to have one or two. And for the more general kind of discussion, we'll have, we'll put most of the questions there. That is after Professor Chater has spoken as well. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Gutman, who's a Professor of Developmental and Health Psychology, and she's the Director of the MSc in Behaviour Change and the Vice Dean, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in our faculty, the Faculty of Brain Sciences. Her work focuses on mental health and well-being, risk and resilience, as well as aspirations and attainment, and very close to my heart, interventions for children and young people using behavior change frameworks are very much needed. Leslie, please do start. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Using the Behavior Change Wheel to Improve Digital Mental Health Interventions to Support Children and Young People's Mental Health. So I think most people in the audience are aware that about 1 in 5 children and young people aged 18 to 19 have a probable mental health problem in England. And we also know that there's a service gap for young people. So young people wait a long time for services. There's an estimation of about 75% actually wait so long that their condition worsens before they receive help. So what can we do about this gap in provision? Well, a lot of young people turn to digital mental health interventions, and you're probably aware of many of these, things such as Headspace, Verywell, Shout, and Kooth. These are digital mental health interventions that are based on the web or mobile, or your mobile, or other aspects. So there's a lot of benefits to these digital mental health interventions. And this includes rapid adoption. For the most sake, they're anonymous, which really helps young people in terms of stigma. They're free and low cost. Many of these are available around the clock. And they're very accessible for young people who are used to using the web and their mobile phones to gather help. And they're also very flexible. So flexible in terms of different options that are available, and people around the UK can all access them. So today I'm going to really talk about one digital mental health intervention, and that's the Mix. And if you haven't heard of the Mix, then I suggest you look at their website. They're UK's leading mental health support service for young people, but they also focus on a lot of other issues just other than mental health. So anything related to young people's well-being, and there's also different resources and services available. So these are some of the services that the Mix offers. They offer discussion boards or online forums. They have particular peer group chats. They also have counseling that's offered web chat. They have helplines, telephone, email, and web chat. These are one-to-one chat services that young people can access. There's also Crisis Messenger that's available through text. And of course, they have also a lot of resources on their website and social media via Instagram and TikTok. So we know that digital mental health interventions can be effective for young people's mental health. And there's evidence, especially that digital mental health interventions that are one-to-one or have an in-person element are effective. But we also know that their effectiveness depends on a lot of different factors. And two important factors are whether young children and young people are actually engaged in these interventions, so whether they're using them, whether they're finding them helpful. And also another factor is the delivery. So the delivery may not be high quality, it may not meet the young person's needs. So these are important factors that can affect the effectiveness of these types of services and interventions. So this is where behavior change fits in. And behavior change, actually, engagement and delivery are really two behaviors. So we can define engagement as a behavior. So it's an observable or active contribution by the young person using the digital mental health intervention. And this is, of course, it's going to differ depending on what type of intervention they're using. But for example, like if we're talking about an online forum, it could be written verbalization, it could be self-expression, it could be posting a question, it could be replying to a question. So there's lots of different ways that we could think about engagement for these types of services. And also delivery or implementation can also be considered a behavior. And of course, again, this is going to differ depending on the particular service that we're focused on. It could be about how counseling support is provided. If you're calling the helpline, it could be how the volunteer is giving signposting to external services, the type of replies they're giving. And it can also be about moderation. And moderation is when volunteers are part of the discussion forums or chat groups, and they make sure the discussions are safe and they remove or edit users' posts as appropriate. So today I'm going to talk about particularly the behavior of engagement. And I'm going to focus on 3 different studies that we did looking at 3 types of digital mental health interventions. I'm focusing on peer online forums. So like I said, these are discussion boards that are asynchronous. So young people can post a question and other young people reply to it. And some people might just read the forum. And again, for the mix, these are moderated to make sure that questions and replies are appropriate and they're safe. There's also peer chat groups. So this is another service that the mix offers where young people agree to meet at a specific time. And again, these are moderated. And then there's web chat counseling. So this is 8 to 10 sessions that young people engage in with a trained counselor. And these are via web chat. So I'm going to introduce you to the behavior change wheel today. And this is the behavior change framework that we use at the Center for Behavior Change. And it involves the behavior change wheel. And inside that wheel, at the center of the wheel, is the COMBI model. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on the COMBI model, but I'm also going to tell you a little bit about intervention types and BCTs that I'll talk about a little bit later. So just to introduce you to the COMBI model basically says that capability, motivation, and opportunity are 3 different influences on behavior. And these are interactive and dynamic, and capability influences motivation, and opportunity also influences motivation. So I'll talk to you a little bit about these 3 influences so you can understand them. So capability is defined as the ability to enact the behavior. And we think of this as either psychological or physical. So psychological can be knowledge or understanding, and physical, for example, can be physical skills. Opportunity is focused on the environment, and it's focused on how the environment enables that behavior or might be a barrier to that behavior. And it can be either thought of as physical or social. So a physical aspect to opportunity would be money. It'd be the actual physical environment around you. It could be something like time. Social opportunity could represent friends and families and relationships. So motivation, we define it as mechanisms that activate or inhibit behavior. And these can be reflective, so having goals, having beliefs about the consequences, having intentions, those are reflective aspects of motivation. There's also more automatic aspects of motivation, and these are things like habits or emotions. So when we think about the COMBI model, there's different questions that we ask to have an understanding of how these different influences can act as barriers or enablers to the particular behavior that we're interested in. So in the studies that I'm going to talk about today, they're all done via interview with young people. And these are the questions that, that would be an example of COMBI questions. So in these particular studies, we ask questions like, what types of skills are important when engaging in this particular service? What do you think are the benefits of engaging in this service? That's for motivation. And how do others, such as friends and family, influence your engagement? And that would be an example of social opportunity. So I'm going to give you an overview of these different studies and the findings that we have, the capability, opportunity, and motivational factors that were similar across these studies. So probably the biggest barrier for young people to engage in these services were, for capability, were communication difficulties. So a lot of young people felt they weren't great at opening up, talking about their feelings, and this really inhibited them from engaging in these services. However, an enabler, especially for peer-based support, so this would be things like the discussion boards and the peer chat when young people are replying to other people's concerns or comments, that was empathy and interpersonal skills. So people who knew how to validate and support others were really engaged in these types of behaviors. So in terms of opportunity, and remember this is focusing on the environment, having a safe environment was really an enabler. And young people really felt that when they were with the counselor, this was a safe environment. And also being in the discussion boards or the online forums and the chat groups, it was also safe. And this is really due to having moderation. So having those trained moderators that are making sure that comments and questions are safeguarded and appropriate. Now, being anonymous could be a barrier or an enabler for different young people. So some young people found that it was an enabler. So the fact that the other person couldn't see them and they were anonymous, they could felt a disinhibition effect, so they could really talk about their feelings. But other people felt that it was a barrier, so they couldn't see the other person. Some people questioned whether there was actually another person there versus an AI. So it could be a barrier or enabler depending on different people and how they interacted with the service. Young people also felt that being able to use it on their mobile was really an important enabler. So like I said, this is a web-based service. So having it optimized to use on the mobile was really important for young people so they could use it on the go and access it whenever they wanted to. And also their interactions with others. So social interactions online were also really important. So if they had a response that was rude or discouraged them, they might not want to engage in that service. But obviously, if they had another response that was encouraging or supportive, then it would encourage them. So it really highlights, again, the importance of having that moderation. So in terms of motivation factors, there was also beliefs about whether actually this was helpful. So if young people felt that the service was helpful, or they felt in peer groups that they could make a reply that would be helpful for the other person, then that was an important enabler of their engagement. But if they felt that it wasn't helpful, they weren't sure if it was going to actually have an improvement for them, then they would be discouraged from using it. So one of the things that was really important throughout that we found is that peer-based support was that for supportive intentions was really an enabler for this type of digital mental health intervention. So a lot of young people felt that they had been through these experiences before and they really wanted to support others. So having these supportive intentions really enabled them to engage in these types of peer-based services. So that's like the online forum and the peer chat. So the emotions of fear and uncertainty were often barriers. So young people who hadn't used the service before or just tried to use the service, they might be afraid, not sure what's going to happen. They didn't have an understanding of how it worked. They were concerned about being rejected. And so this was really a barrier for them using it. But after young people used it, they found that really positive emotions was an important enabler. So a lot of people said that, they felt that using these services really made them feel better, made them feel supported. And of course, that was something that encouraged them for using it more. So now that we have an understanding of the barriers and enablers to engaging with these digital mental health interventions, we can use the behavior change wheel to have particular intervention types, and that's shown in the red layer of the wheel. And that gives us broad intervention types in order to tackle these barriers and to facilitate or enhance these enablers. And these are done through experts' consensus that you can find in the Behavior Change Wheel book. Now, there's also more specific and granular behavior change techniques, and these are very specific intervention strategies that we can pair with our intervention with the different barriers and enablers to suggest contextualized intervention strategies. So, for example, if we are wanting to tackle the barrier of communication difficulties, then we might want to use the BCT of instruction on how to perform a behavior. And then we contextualize that BCT to think about, well, young people could be provided with access to a video that gives them techniques on how to frame and express their emotional states. I might give them useful opportunities or examples or reflection sheets on how they can express themselves. So for opportunity, and that was, we might want to use the BCT of restructuring the physical environment. And so that would relate to our barriers and enablers. So for example, for the idea of being anonymous is a barrier, well, counselors could send a short video or avatar of their face, give them an audio bite introducing themselves so we know the young people know it's a real person and they can identify with themselves more. And obviously another important aspect is having these moderators to give peer support and to assure that these types of services are safe. So for motivation, we could use the BCT of social comparison. And so this could really help with beliefs about helpfulness and fear and uncertainty. So one of the things that we suggested is that actually they could create an online forum where service users could discuss their own experiences with counseling. So if they have fear and uncertainty about counseling or any of the other services, then they can talk about it with other young people and they can see that it's been helpful and they can alleviate their feelings of uncertainty about how it's going to go forward. So what I want to highlight about these strategies that we offered is actually they have real world implications. So we work closely with the mix and we discuss our findings with them and present them, and they really consider on how they can use those findings to improve their services. So for example, this is the impact review from 2021, and as you can see, they used some of our suggestions. So they introduced counselor bios, they had an introductory email, and they also included a new website content that focused on pre-session anxiety and what to expect with videos and real live testimony. So they use these strategies in order to tackle those barriers that we identified in our interviews. And the other thing that I just want to mention that the mix does, they have a strong youth voice group, and they use this to co-design with young people. And that's really important when we're contextualizing these BCTs, because we want to make sure that they're really acceptable and feasible for young people. So often as researchers, we might suggest BCTs based on other research or evidence, but we really want to make sure that we have, we co-design what these BCTs are actually going to look like with young people. And that's exactly what the mix does. And here's a link to one of their blogs on how they do that. So I just want to highlight the take-home messages of my talk today. So the young people's reasons for engaging or not engaging in these types of services really reflect a range of capability, opportunity, and motivation factors as reflected in the COMBI model. And we saw today how the behavior change wheel can be used to identify strategies which can identify these barriers and enablers, and then also tackle those barriers and enhance those enablers and really improve and optimize these digital mental health interventions. And of course, the importance of using co-design with young people with lived experience to ensure that the strategies that we suggest are acceptable and informed decision-making. So if you want to do any further reading, I have posted here some of our published articles, and these both include engagement and also moderation and delivery of the services.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Gutman. That's a great overview. I know that people have questions already. We said that we're going to discuss the overall questions at the end, if that's all right. But if people have things they would like to clarify now, this is the time to ask. Please remember that you can also put I strongly encourage people actually to put their questions into the chat, and I'm very happy to read them out. People have contacted me already with some questions, so but I think they pertain to the overall and the general, and they might be best discussed at the end, if that's all right with you, Leslie. Is that okay?
That sounds great. I look forward to it.
Brilliant. Well, it is a great pleasure to now announce Professor Angel Chater. Professor Chater is the director of the UCL-hub for the NIHR-funded policy research unit, the PRU in Behavioral and Social Sciences, which is based at the Center for Behaviour Change. And she's a director for sport and physical activities research at the University of Bedfordshire as well. She applies behavioral science in her research to understand and intervene with factors that influence behaviors, particularly in relation to physical activity, again, something which is very close to my heart as well, that impact on health, illness, and well-being, psychological well-being within the healthcare system. So very important topics. Professor Chater, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, is that working?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Okay, thank you for this invitation. It's lovely to talk about this topic. And I'm going to talk about experiences of parental bereavement as a young person and the role physical activity may have. So looking at the other end of behaviour change, really, and looking at whether this behaviour could help or hinder a certain situation, in this case, a parental death. When you look at parental bereavement that's in the public eye, something you might be familiar with, it's often in the news reports. Some classic examples would be, for example, Prince William and Prince Harry after the death of Lady Diana. Professor Green, who is a musician who talks quite openly about his parental death. Callum Best, who experienced the death of his dad, George Best, and Bobby Christina, whose mum was Whitney Houston. And often what you see in this public eye is these young people exhibiting signs of grief, but not having that privacy to be able to process their grief because they are in the public eye. And the parental death can increase a lot of risk factors. With Bobby Christina, it led to her taking her own life. It leads to social withdrawal, isolation, depression, anxiety, alcohol misuse, drug use, and suicide ideation. And often things that perhaps we wouldn't consider to be detrimental during that process of bereavement, these young people have talked about. So Prince William and Prince Harry talked about how traumatic it was, for example, to walk behind the coffin during a funeral, knowing that their mum was just a few steps ahead. And when you look at the support that there is for young people who've experienced a bereavement, often it's talking therapies, but often young people don't want to engage in those sorts of therapies. And there's no national childhood bereavement database. So when a child experiences the death of a parent, there's no register. When you register a death, you register for a spouse if they're married, but you don't register whether they have children or dependent children. And so often schools, colleges, universities, who are often the people who are mainly around children and young people, they will rely on family, either the surviving parent or the caregivers around that young person, or the young person themselves, to inform them that there's been a parental death. That might not always happen, and sometimes it takes years, even decades, for people to go and get some help. When we look at the statistics, when we did a piece of research that I'm going to present to you today, there was about 23,500 parents that died within the UK that year, leaving about 41,000 dependent children. That significantly shot up during COVID for obvious reasons, but around a parent dies around every 22 minutes, and 1 in 29 children have been bereaved of either a parent or a sibling, which averages out to about 1 in every classroom. Now, my interest in this area really is very personal. In 2015, so just before we started this research, my children became part of this statistic. So my partner, their dad died in 2015, and our whole family crumbled. And I watched my 2 children grieve, but I watched them grieve very differently. Our daughter Tia, in the picture in the top right there, she was 20 at the time, which was actually the same age I was when my dad died. And because she was over 18, was at university, had a social, had a very thriving social network, and also worked within bars and within clubs, her coping mechanism very much was around going out, drinking alcohol, and so on. Whereas our son was 13, he was younger. His coping mechanism was much more around physical activity. He really struggled at school, and his PE teacher took him under his wing and said, look, don't worry about classes, English, maths. If you can't concentrate, come with me and help with the PE classes. And I honestly believe that it probably saved his life. He spent a lot of time with his basketball coach. He went out cycling, and his friends were incredibly supportive. Neither of them wanted to talk in therapy. We had an organisation called Chums, which is a local child bereavement organisation, come to our house and visit, helped with liaisons with the school. They didn't want to talk to the person who was coming round. They didn't really want to talk to their teachers or their college lecturers. And at the time I was working at UCL, before I joined the Centre for Behaviour Change, in the Centre for Behavioural Medicine, and an opportunity came up for me to move to the University of Bedfordshire, which is where I was previously, which was much more closer to home, to join a school of sports science and physical activity. So I made the decision to go closer, to be nearer the children. And I knew already from kind of, researching the literature that physical activity can benefit grief-related outcomes. It can decrease depression, anxiety, it can improve self-esteem and quality of life, it can help control aggression, and it helps with isolation. All of these things I was seeing in my own children, in my own behaviour even. And we know, and Leslie's just mentioned that there is a high level of anxiety and depression within children and young people already, regardless of a parental death. There was also evidence that it can support bereavement with adults as well. So you have that kind of family link. There was a program called Mind Over Marathon. If you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it, where someone experienced the death of a husband and their son within the same time, and running really helped them. And so when I moved to the University of Bedfordshire, there was an application for funding, and so I applied through the Institute for Sport and Physical Activity Research, which I'm now the director of, for a PhD looking at parental bereavement and physical activity. We recruited Jane Williams, who's now completed her PhD and is an academic in her own right, and we developed a programme which we call Baby Steps, which stands for Belonging After Bereavement in the Young, support through exercise, physical activity and sport. And this shortened to BS, and that's quite important. The reason we did that is because when my partner died and my son was informed of his death, the first thing he said as a 13-year-old, I won't say the words, but basically this is BS. And so we wanted to kind of bring that in. So the work I'm going to present from here on in is very much acknowledged to Jane here and her PhD. So we started with a systematic review. We wanted to really understand whether physical activity as a behaviour could support grief outcomes in individuals who'd experienced a bereavement. We first looked at parental bereavement and realised there was really a very small amount of research in the area, just a few studies with only 1 or 2 teams who were doing that research. So we widened it out to any bereavement, and we managed to get our screening down to 25 papers we could qualitatively synthesise. Now this covered 8 different types of bereavement, parental being one, but also spousal bereavement with either a husband or a wife or a partner, patient bereavement, prenatal, later care, caregiver, multiple different bereavements, and one that just didn't specify. And this is all published in open access for you to look in more detail. But in brief, we asked the question, can physical activity help grief outcomes? And we concluded the answer was yes. There were 26 different grief outcomes mentioned in those papers. The most common was depression, anxiety, and stress. And we wanted to understand what physical activity might be beneficial. And what we found was outdoor activities were often used, walking, running, cycling, hiking, as well as relaxation or focused mind activities, so yoga or MMA, mixed martial arts. And then team sports, so things like football and rugby. And what we found in this review was physical activity can help build resilience. It can improve our self-esteem and decrease senses of loneliness. It helps to bring you together with others in similar situations. It causes a distraction of the bereavement. It creates a sense of freedom. It helps to retain memories we may have with those family members, and it allows for family cohesion. So we then wanted to understand what it was like to experience the death of a parent as a young person. So we knew physical activity could help. We wanted to take it back even further. And this was a spin-out project as part of the PhD, where we interviewed 14 people who had experienced the death of a parent when they were aged between 11 to 24 years old, with a mean age of 17. And it was fairly equal for males and females. And what we found was when a parent dies, there's this initial feeling of distance and isolation. People don't know how to react, and you tend to block it out and block everything around you out. Participants talked about this emotional journey. You go through denial, anxiety, anger, guilt, devastation, depression, and you're filled with these different emotions. And it has a physical impact in relation to maladaptive behaviour. There was a lot of conversations around drug use, for example, and physical reactions, things like panic attacks. But they also talked about this concept of post-traumatic growth. And when Jane first brought this concept to me, and I was obviously in the midst of it at the time myself, watching my children kind of grieve, I said to her, there can't be a post-traumatic growth. That just doesn't feel right. And now, you know, I'm now 9 years on, I can absolutely see where this is in our data. So people said that it helped give you a perspective in life. It helped to sharpen what life really is and to live for the moment. Helped to build resilience and build relationships with other people, because you really realise that life is too short. So you do things perhaps because the person has died, for them, for yourself, and so on. But they did acknowledge that life would never be the same again. It forced them to grow up quickly, and that parental influence never stopped. They talked about, you know, going, you know, my mum or my dad would always say this, or would think that, or be proud of me, or whatever. And they really harnessed the importance of support and understanding. So feeling loved, supported, and having the right time to talk, as well as the impact that some religion would have. And finally, they talked about this concept of regrief. So they may be many years after that parental death, but if a major life event happens, perhaps they've got a driving test, they're going to university, they're having a baby, or even for the younger ones, having a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or their GCSEs, those major life events triggered a regrief that brought them back to feeling that parental loss. It also often happens at birthdays, at Christmases, and other anniversaries. But they did have this acceptance that they had a new life. So we then asked the question to the group of participants, what role does physical activity play after the death of the parent? And they told us that it can be therapeutic, it can help to clear the mind, give distraction, and process thoughts, very much like the systematic review had told us. So, you know, people are in these quotes saying, you know, there's something quite cathartic about being physically active. And you just set yourself loftier and higher goals all of the time. It also allowed that emotional outlet to release the anger, the frustration, and it provided enjoyment and pleasure. So, you know, one person said there are lots of feelings, you know, you can be angry in bereavement, you can be really down and sad. But actually, if you get out and do physical activity, both those things and all those things are going to get better. You're going to feel better. It also provided social support, so friendship, and this concept of paying it forward. So in friendship, someone said, you know, I'd go to the gym with my neighbour, I would go to netball with my girlfriends. It would just be something to look forward to. But the paying it forward part often would be around charity events, for example. So Rebecca here said, you know, charity runs probably make everyone feel better. Everyone is running, everyone is doing stuff for the exact same cause, to raise money, to try not to make it happen to someone in the future. It was also thought to build confidence, so the strength to overcome challenges and to obtain new goals. Zara said, you know, again, for me, it's tough at times of that climb. I really pulled onto that, and the strength that I can get through this, the strength that mum has died and I can do this. So they felt like they've overcome, you know, one of the worst challenges in their life. So I think this might have been a quote around climbing Mount Everest, you know, if they can do that, then they can do anything. And so you see people offering different goals and finding ways to control their emotions and their thought processes. And ultimately, this led to people finding themselves. So being someone new and developing a positive routine. Kate here said, you know, when I joined the badminton team, I had people that I could relate to on a sporting level. I could be myself again. And Rebecca said, I just got to that stage where I needed to start getting back into a routine and do something normal. And finally, people really reinforced the fact that it improved their health and well-being. So Gail says, I felt healthier, I could breathe more. And Ben said, you know, I felt I was in control of my experience, I was improving my health. It felt like I had some control over my life. So all of these concepts really fall into Martin Seligman's concept of PERMA, thinking about positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And we wanted to go into these physical activity programs with young people and see from an ethnographical perspective what it's actually like. And Jane went and spent some time with the Children's Trust, which is a charity that helps children of armed forces and police forces who experienced the death of a parent whilst in service. And she attended a physical activity brief camp, which was basically an outdoors kind of, I think they were week-long, out of bounds type vacation for young people. And she went to this a couple of times and just embedded herself as a support network within this camp. She had 24 people attend, and she would ask them questions about what it was like, how the physical activities like canoeing and climbing and all the other things they were doing helped them. And again, they said it was a safe space to process emotions. It offered distraction and freedom, social support, and helped to build trust. And it gave them someone like me to be around. Helped to build confidence and self-esteem, and build resilience towards challenging situations. And, you know, they would say things like, you know, again, when they were asked to kind of jump off of a cliff into the sea or whatever they were doing, that having people around them that have had similar experiences and that social support and camaraderie really helped them to overcome their fears. So in terms of the impact of this work, when COVID-19 happened, we had already gathered quite a body of evidence around bereavement support. And we put that support into some publications that were published by the British Psychological Society on supporting people following the death of a colleague, and also supporting yourself and others after someone has died. We created an online tool which was interactive. You could click on different buttons to help with continuing bonds with people who've died. And there were lots of different things like creating a Facebook page, or lighting a candle, or making a memory box. And this was all part of the bereavement and care work stream of the task force for the COVID-19 coordinating group for the British Psychological Society. And I was involved in that alongside a behavioural science and disease prevention task force. The other thing that happened at the very beginning of COVID that helped to inform all of this was, sadly, my PhD supervisor also died. And Marcia Worrell was a professor in psychology and did a lot of work with children and young people. And the grief, although it was, you know, at 5+ years on, that grief comes back to service, and you could really feel that re-grief. And I'm quite good at having open conversations about death and loss. It's my research area. I've experienced it a lot, and it's something that I'm happy to do. But a lot of people aren't. And one of the things that really came out of our research was young people felt other people were walking on eggshells around them. They didn't want to have conversations with them. And so they would feel quite ostracized within the classroom because, you know, that young person was the one whose mum or dad died, and nobody really wanted to talk about it. And I've definitely experienced that myself, as well as the children. So we developed this concept of your world and the ball of grief. And ultimately, in the bottom right image here, if you just imagine your world as a circle and you've got everything going on in it, when you experience the bereavement, you may suddenly have a ball of grief. And some people will say that that ball gets smaller over time. And what happens is that ball kind of hits on a pain kind of button, and you have this constant feeling of pain, and people say, well, that might just get reduced over time. But actually, what we suggest is that your world gets bigger, and the grief may not change. It certainly won't go away. It's still in there within your world, but actually you learn to grow your world around it so that it's not hitting on that pain button quite as quickly. But it may be that during regrief, it's brought more higher up to the surface, and then that's why you experience much more grief outcomes when you're experiencing regrief triggers. And during COVID, you also had what we conceptualize as grief empathy. So you know how other people feel because you have felt that in the past, and it may not be the same, but you at least can relate to someone like me. And when all of a sudden you've got lots of people talking about death on a daily basis, you couldn't turn the news on during COVID-19 without someone talking about death and bereavement. All of a sudden you've got your grief, the regrief of the trigger, and everyone else's grief that you're empathizing with, that becomes quite consuming. So we spent a lot of time talking about ways in which we could help people to talk openly about about death, sorry. Now, there's huge opportunities here for behaviour change, and there needs to be more consideration to services offered to people who've experienced the death of a parent or a death of a loved one, or indeed a patient or colleague. What we found is young people don't want to sit with a stranger and talk about their dead parent, and physical activity offers many benefits that take them away from the awkwardness of sitting there, and could put them in a situation with other people like them without the direct conversation needed. When we think about a COM-B analysis, we need to do that for a number of different behaviours that are related to the grieving process. So we did begin looking at COM-B in relation to physical activity, things like knowing how to have a conversation, feeling motivated to do that and not worrying that there's going to be a negative consequence at the end of it, and having the social and physical opportunity to do that are all really important. But there are other behaviours that we need to consider. Being able to speak openly about death and grief in itself needs capability, opportunity and motivation. Asking people if they want to discuss the death of a loved one is a behaviour that may have different COM factors that would influence whether people do or don't do that. And from a more organisational perspective, organisations creating opportunities where people can meet with others and perhaps be physically active within their bereavement process. So things like walking together, team activities, having places to just sit with our thoughts or to talk about them. And there also needs to be better bereavement and communication training within schools, health and social care and voluntary organisations. We've done a separate piece of work where we surveyed school teachers and asked them about their how they would behave when a child, if they were told that a child in their class had experienced a parental death. Many of them said they didn't know. They said they didn't have training in the area. They weren't sure where they could signpost people to, and so on. So there's more training needed on how to start a conversation, on that signposting support, and indeed from a wider level on developing physical activity programs to support grief in areas like simple things like walking. And also to help to lead to simple tweaks in language that can open up conversations. So instead of saying, "Are you okay?" which might close down the conversation, the young person might just say yes, but not really mean it. Actually saying, you know, "How are you doing?" Or "How can I help?" Okay, so I'll leave it there. I just really do want to acknowledge Jane. This is a huge body of work from her PhD, supported by 3 other colleagues, Neil Howlett, Gillian Shorter and Julia Frewer. So yeah, big thank you to them, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Angel. This was extremely powerful, I must say. Thank you very, very much.
No problem.
So it is time for the general discussion, which is really great. So I hope that our two speakers are prepared for lots of questions that I'm sure the audience will have. Can I use chairman's prerogative, whatever, privilege, and ask the first question to you, Angel, which is I've been interested in this for a long time. That different cultures obviously treat death and bereavement in different ways, and I've been thinking that we live in very particular times. Like over the last 100 years, death has become much rarer around us in reality, right? I mean, if you lived even in the beginning, the first half of the 20th century, you'd be much more likely to experience death, not just through war in our kind of geographic locations, but also mainly through infant mortality, for example, right? So what is your view on this kind of, on this relative rarity of death, particularly of younger people, of unexpected deaths, and the impact it has on how we deal with it as a society? Thank you.
That's a big question. I think going to the first part of your question around different cultures, you're absolutely right. And I have to say, this piece of research was in the UK with a very much UK death focus. You go to somewhere like Spain or Mexico, the way in which they deal with and indeed celebrate death is very different. You know, you celebrate the life and all the rest of it, whereas here, death is much more awkward, taboo. People find it very icky to talk about. So it's challenging. I think since COVID, I think maybe we may have had that period where death was more for the old than it was for the young, as it would have been when we had higher you know, child mortality or war or whatever. But I think COVID's changed that a little bit, and I think it has had a bit of a surge and put death back on the radar a little bit more than it was before. But ultimately, I think different people deal with it in different ways. And I think the most difficult part of what we see is when people don't deal with it at all. And I think when we come back to what we're looking at in terms of mental health, when it's not talked about, then people aren't learning how to manage, how to behave, how to react, etc. And what happens, I think, is maybe the less it's there and in our face, if you like, the less it's talked about, the less younger people are learning how to manage it, and the less they're not managing it, and it's leading to these kind of more negative psychological consequences.
Yeah, it's very interesting about the talking that, as you know much better than I do probably, there are whole cultures where people are actually hired to talk about the dead, and you know, the whole vigil is around talking about the death, and there's a whole kind of ritual around the talking, which is fascinating. Yes. There's another question which is in the chat, and I do encourage people to put their questions in the chat. It is Dr. Julia Clemens, who asks, says, this is brilliant research, to you and your PhD student, I agree. Did you find any differences amongst the young people with regards to the nature of the parental death? For example, whether it was sudden and unexpected, such as a suicide or a murder, or an expected death due to, say, chronic illness?
We did actually look at the difference between two. Thank you, Julia, for your comments, and thank you for your question. We did look at whether it was an expected or an unexpected death, because in the literature, if it is a death which is perhaps sudden and there is another person involved, whether it be a murder or whether it be, perhaps, for example, a road traffic accident or a fault at work or something like that, then there was this element of additional layer of anger, and often there's a concept of complicated grief, which happens around those sorts of deaths, because it's not only the bereavement that happens, in their natural grief process, but there's also the added layer of the why that happens. But it's not to say that a natural death that doesn't happen as well, because, you know, whatever that natural death might be, there may still be questions around, you know, why that person, why that time in their life, and so on and so forth. So in our research, we didn't find any obvious differences between the two in relation to physical activity, but we did certainly look at those two to see whether there might be any differences. There was, when we were looking at the behaviours, there were only a few differences between what males and females would like, but definitely the males were perhaps exhibiting more anger and frustration and were siding more towards things like boxing, MMA, and rugby type sports, whereas the females were more around walking, running, and so on. Actually, we asked all of them what their top ones would be, and walking and running were at the top over and above every other physical activity.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm coming to questions to you, Leslie. And this one is from my partner in the Grand Challenges, Professor Vidding, who's asking, in terms of she says, great talk. She's on the train and written to me via WhatsApp, and I'm the mouthpiece now. So she says, great talk, and in terms of the barriers and the enablers you mentioned, what's their relative weighting? Do we have evidence on how, for example, some of these subjective feelings impact on the outcomes, and what the relative effect sizes are, and how best to study them? Which is I agree, an excellent question, and came to my mind as I was hearing about positive affect, for example, and so on. So I don't know whether you would like to comment on that, Leslie.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, because these are really exploratory studies and they're all qualitative. Then we don't necessarily have quantitative evidence of their impact on actual effectiveness. So I can't tell you what one barrier might how that might influence an intervention, for example. And really what we tried to do in qualitative analysis is understand, well, this is a barrier for many people, but even if it's an enabler for other people, to try to understand, well, what is it about that barrier enabler that might be a barrier for one group, but an enabler for another group. So I agree, having more of a quantitative analysis, maybe a larger survey once we understand the barriers and enablers, and looking into that more particularly, or maybe doing a systematic review and seeing if there's evidence of that. But there's not so much work on this area particularly. So to be honest, I don't know what the quantitative impact of each barrier enabler is from these studies.
Yeah. And it would be quite a task to actually model that. I was thinking, as Essie asked this question, in terms of the quantitative, and because you probably wouldn't want to unpick it in one study for each one of them, but have some other way of going about it. It's going to be quite interesting to do. Yeah, thank you very much. Extremely interesting. Another question. I don't have the name of the person who asks the question. It's CJD015 in the chat. Both really interesting presentations. Thank you. You may have mentioned this, but what role does guilt for the death, often assumed, play, and how can the child be helped? You did talk about guilt, but I think going into a bit more depth would be very interesting indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we did see a lot of both guilt in relation to the death, but also survivor guilt. I never used to like the word survivor either when I was back in the early parts of that bereavement, but actually you see that a lot in the literature. But what we found was having a space, particularly physical activity, where they can go and either be on their own, it might be a walk, a long walk, a run, a climb, or it might be in a team environment. it helped people to process those emotions, not just guilt, you know, there were lots of other emotions there, but helped to process it and to escape from some of that as well, and to perhaps process the reality of the situation, and you know, not necessarily you know, it may well be assumed, but it's certainly not a reality that, you know, it is anyone's fault. So yeah, we did see that physical activity could support the processing of those sorts of emotional kind of automatic thoughts that young people might have.
Thank you so much, Angel. That's really very helpful. Dr. Maddie Payne via the chat, both brilliant talks, thank you. The question is for Leslie, and it's around peer-to-peer fora for young people. How does one avoid unhelpful behaviors such as co-ruminating? And they may not look as, you know, aggressive comments, but they may still be unhelpful. It's a very good question, actually. I would like to know myself. I don't know whether you'd like to comment, Leslie.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I mean, I think the other thing is that this is kind of an important role for the moderators. And one of the things that we found with many of the people who are volunteer, because these are volunteer roles that people take when they're moderators in these types of forums, and many of them have experienced have lived experience, so they can often find that for themselves, like this might be a trigger, and it can be difficult for them. So I think having that that experience is really important, and having that training for moderators so they can ensure that the comments are going to be helpful for young people. I mean, it is interesting also how young people can engage in the forums differently. So, you know, we have some people who are quite active in peer-to-peer forums. They post questions, and like I mentioned, they like to give supportive responses and to help others. And that's kind of a way that they can also help with their own mental health issues, because they're feeling like they're supporting others in that. And then we have people who might be considered more lurkers, where they're just reading the content. And whether that has a negative impact, that's something that we haven't really examined yet, but it is really an interesting question.
Thank you very much. Dr. Somerville, two really interesting talks. Thank you both. I have a question for Leslie. I was particularly interested in the opportunity factor in the COM-B model, as it relates to some work we're currently doing in secondary schools with the digital emotion regulation intervention. We're now focusing on how consistent the content of our intervention is with the mental health messaging the students are receiving from their teachers. In your interviews, did this come up at all? The consistency in terms of DMHI content, you may want to remind people of the abbreviations again, Leslie, and the messages they are getting at home or school or other contexts.
Okay, I'm just going to read it, because actually I was looking at the comment before that, because I saw there was one in the middle.
So yeah,
so
no,
I'm just
Professor Heyman
read
asked
it
the
to
question. I'm
myself
going to go back to
quickly.
that, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that is a social opportunity factor. And some young people do feel that when they're getting messages at home or in school to seek help seeking, and that there's less stigma around mental health, and they're more likely to seek it. Whereas if parents are discouraging them, or friends discouraging them from being involved in this, then it's going to obviously be a barrier for them. And some young people even mentioned that, you know, they were afraid to post because someone might know them. So they had to be very particular on how they posted. So I think there is quite an interest in thinking about stigma and how that is a message from parents and from friends. I think there's a few questions in here actually that I'm looking at now. Because Okay, with the teachers, okay. I think also just the definition of engagement and help seeking is really important in how you think about that in your own intervention. So, I mean, one of the things that I recently read was that actually we don't want young people to engage in interventions because that, you know, it shows that they're still needing that support. And I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. And I think it really depends on the type of intervention that we're talking about. Like I mentioned, with peer-to-peer support, young people engage in that intervention to help others. It's a way of indirectly supporting their own mental health, feeling like they're having a positive contribution. And also, the more people that engage in something like an online forum, the more, the more hits, the more content there is available for people who might not necessarily post on that online forum, but might find that reading the posts are really helpful. So, I mean, that's just kind of going back to your question about, I think that's going back to the other question about engagement that Isabel had.
Yeah. Isabel, does that cover your question as well? Would you like to elaborate at all? Is that okay?
Sorry, couldn't find my microphone. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Great, great. Are there any other questions from the audience that people would like to ask? That you don't need to necessarily put it in the to write it. Please feel free to ask. I have a question around. Oh no, there's Dr. Pezzoli put something in the chat about the next Catalyst seminar. Please take notice. It's on the 12th of March, and it's about health and education amongst vulnerable adolescents. So with great speakers again. So please take note of that. But we have a bit of time for some more questions. So if I might ask another one then, if I may. Going back to the bereavement question again, the questions around bereavement, loss and bereavement. Traditionally, again, roles in bereavement and how one grieves about the deceased has been very gendered. So in some of these traditions, the ritual laments, for example, are primarily performed by women rather than men. Most of the talking that we're talking about before was done by women more than men. Now, these were in societies where gendered roles were much more common than in our society, probably. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned already in one of your responses, the types of sporting activities that were chosen, but is there anything else you would like to say around that and around the propensity for each gender to talk about death and willingness and yeah.
So interestingly, I don't think that came up as much as we thought it would. When we first began this research, the physical activity teams that we were working with had very much planned some interventions already, which looked like football for boys, dance for girls. And we kind of halted right at the very beginning and said, is that what they want? In terms of the genders of the stereotypes, is that really a thing? Will they engage in the way that we think they would? And we went out and asked young people, and we did a big survey as well that we haven't had time to present here, and it's not what they wanted at all. And if anything, there was more similarities between the two genders than there were differences. With the interviews, there weren't any real marked differences, I don't think, between the men and the women, the boys and the girls, the two different genders. I think, if anything, from memory, perhaps the males spoke a little bit more about drug and alcohol use, and the females talked a lot more about having to hold up the family. So I remember in interviews, having to look after their dad, their mum had died, having to look after their dad and their siblings, for example. Whereas I remember the young men kind of going quite into themselves, isolating, using drugs, alcohol, and feeling quite aggressive, quite a lot of aggression. But that might just be the sample, because it was a small sample of 14, so it's not, we couldn't generalize that across, you know, a large population. But when we did our survey and we asked what people wanted, maybe expecting there to be some gender differences, there wasn't really massive ones at all. You're on mute.
I was just saying, this is fascinating. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? We have 2 minutes. No? Well, I'm going to ask the last one then, since I may. You talked, I mean, you in particular, Angel, but I think Leslie may have alluded to it as well. You used the term, Angel, which was post-bereavement growth, I think. Reminded me a lot of what Mike Rutter used to call stealing effect with the double E, or, you know, achieving not despite, but, you know, because of, you know. And so I was just interested in that. We have 2 minutes, as I said, where you could perhaps say some more about this fascinating and counterintuitive concept, which of course is not there to deny all the pain that goes with grief. It's not about that. Yes.
Yeah. So the concept was post-traumatic growth. So instead of the post-traumatic stress that would often come, and it came out in the literature before it came out in our interviews, actually. But it is this concept of growing or thriving, as you say, in spite of or because of the situation that they find themselves in, and it looked different for different people. But you know, it would be things like pushing their boundaries, where normally they would say no to something that scared them, and that this isn't just physical activity, this is anything in life. They would say yes to it because they might not be able to say yes to it one day, you know, and other people before them have died and can't say yes to it anymore. So their life was growing because they'd experienced that bereavement. But it also was in relation to relationships. So previously they might have took things for granted. You know, you might have a throwaway conversation and go out the door, slam the door, and you know, not kind of take a moment to reflect, maybe apologize if needed, you know, make peace. And so their ability to have relationships with people showed growth as well, because they never knew when, you know, they would never see people again, and they would give themselves challenges or goals in memory of the person that's died, things that they would have never done before, like, for example, climbing Mount Everest, or you know, going to another country and doing a degree or whatever it might be. And I suppose they're seizing the opportunity to live, because perhaps other people can't. So as a concept, it showed that it was post-trauma, but it was growth.
Thank you very much for this answer. Thank you, Professor Gutman. Thank you, Professor Chater, for both these amazing talks and all your answers to the questions. I'm sure that people will want to follow up with you. I hope that is okay, and ask yet more questions. Please all join me in a virtual applause for our two speakers. And thank you all very much. Please again take note of the next Catalyst seminar. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.